the nature of innovation is you have to experiment a lot. We're trying new technologies or new ways of applying technologies all the time. But I remember when I started here, one of my early bits of feedback was, "You're not failing fast enough."
Hi, this is Jay Faulkner, and I'm here with the G-Research Open Source Software Outreach Podcast, the GR-OSS OUT Podcast. We're going to gross you out with real stories from people working in and around open source. And today, we're actually going a little bit outside of my comfort zone. Usually, we talk to people who are influential in open source and things like that. And in this case, I'm talking to someone who's influential at G-Research a little bit here, Mark Burnett. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do at G-Research? To get us started here.
Sure. Thanks, Shay. So I'm the head of technology innovation at G-Research, and that is all about exploring what are the trends in industry, what are the new technologies that are emerging either now or in the future, and how could these be better than the technology that we're currently using. I have a team that works on proof of concepts, does comparative benchmarking, creates prototypes, and because we're trying to, really be at the forefront, at the cutting edge, we're also engaging in collaborations with startups or working with universities, so some academic engagements as well. So PhDs that are really trying to find out what is the next thing.
Okay, I'm sure as part of that work that you probably use a couple of open source tools to help you get your job done. Is that something that like y'all generally use in your quiver to help you figure out what's innovative, or maybe is open source some of the innovative stuff you're trying out?
So open source is a big part of, say, the tech stack at G-Research, and my team actually works closely with teams inside, but also with the open source team itself, because often there's, every company's got its own special challenges, if you like. And when people are creating software, the aim is to make it generally appealing. But the need to, say, adapt software to special use cases often means that we're trying to get people to contribute or add new features to open source, or work with vendors that, even if we're paying an enterprise license, there's like an element of their software that are open source, and we're trying to partner with them in a way that we can suggest features that will be useful in general, but particularly relevant for us and the challenges we're facing.
Well, one of the neat things that I've seen kind of from this OSS perspective, having worked in Gross for a good 3 years now, is that I don't think people understand the value that G-Research provides, not necessarily just as a company that like contributes to open source or gives a patch here or there, or that sort of contribution, but also simply being a vocal customer and talking about positives and negatives of software and being open about that sort of experiential thing and being that customer is really valuable. That's an issue actually we deal with in my open source project a lot, where it's actually hard to get our customers to admit to being our customers and tell us what's working well and what's not working well for them. So G-Research sort of being that model customer is actually a very valuable thing. And I'm sure a lot of that ends up coming from your group. But
Yeah.
part of the reason we have you here actually is because we wanted to talk a little bit, not necessarily about the software specifically, but about like some of the community concepts of open source and how they might apply in other contexts. And I'm a big fan of that. In fact, that's kind of I'm an open source hippie, right? Like part of the reason I picked this as a career path is because I love the idea that I'm cooperating with people on different continents throughout the world. Even, at times working, I might work for a company that competes with another company, but those are still people that I'm collaborating with because we're solving problems together. Is there some sort of bits from that collaboration that carry over into a corporate world?
Absolutely. In fact, a really good example of that is, the nature of innovation is you have to experiment a lot. We're trying new technologies or new ways of applying technologies all the time, but I remember when I started here, one of my early bits of feedback was, "You're not failing fast enough." And, that failing, is it really failing? Or there's different kinds of success. If you can eliminate something that isn't going to help you, that's good. But that's not a negative thing either, because all of the vendors that we work with, be they startups or well-established vendors, we aim very hard to give them like full feedback. If there's something that works, that's great. We adopt it and we'll tell them why. If there's something we can't adopt for some reason, we'll also tell them why, and we'll put the effort in to say, these are the kind of changes that could be made that would make this adoptable in future, or could make it more appealing. And you could say, like, open innovation is a kind of a term. This idea that we've got a roadmap and we want to get somewhere, and we know that there's all these vendors with their products in different levels of maturity and fit for us. If we can share ideas with them that would enable them to enhance their product such that our roadmaps would align in the future, then that's great. We've helped them innovate. We've got something else that, will help us down the road.
Yeah, open source often, and I work in one of the like slower moving open source projects. Like, it's been very refreshing working here, and the fact that y'all tend to think on the long term horizons, that it's not necessarily a quarter by quarter thing that I've experienced at some public companies where you had to immediately provide value, but there's kind of acceptance of this idea that it takes time to build something that's of quality, that's, going to be one of the best in the world technology solutions. That's not the sort of thing that you're going to be able to devise and deliver in a short-term investment time frame.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, some companies we work with, startups that, I've been introduced to when they were in stealth. And it was clear that, this is a really cool design, but there's just some element of it that it's not quite what would work for us. But because it's so good, and they're early stage, and companies like that often are willing to engage in that dialogue. And if we can share enough details of why something's important and what would make it work for us, then, there's one company in particular we worked with for 3 years before we actually adopted it. But then when we did adopt it, we became the biggest customer overnight.
So, kind of thinking about the parallels to open source, I think it's pretty clear. But I'm worrying about scratching my own itch a little bit as an upstream open source contributor, and I like the fact that G Research gives all this feedback. So, like, what would you say to maybe if there's someone who is an executive or decision maker at a large company who maybe aren't being as public and open with their vendors or with their open source software they use? Is there maybe a specific example of a benefit we've gained from sharing that with an open source group, or that have we had to overcome those similar issues inside of G Research of people being a little bit afraid of being open?
Yeah, there's definitely. I mean, one thing I would say is that building relationships and having connections with people, it isn't always about the short term, like the quick win. Often salespeople approach with the expectation that they want to close a deal, and we've got to do it before year end or before the next quarter or whatever. But that is quite a superficial way of approaching it, and that will turn off a lot of companies that are, where perhaps it's, that's not relevant or it's not the right time. But if you can find that there is actually some connection, like some synergy there that would make sense at some point in the future, and that's understood, and you get through to the right contacts, and you can build that relationship, then that can turn into a lot of value on both sides. And as long as you can be very frank about that, and there's no expectations or costs, then it should be a win-win.
With this idea of collective intelligence and open innovation, some of the things that I've seen a lot on the GR-OSS side, that's one of the things I appreciate, is that we're encouraging innovation even at like the university level and working with people there to produce. And there was a great set of presentations at the Open Infra Days at Pasadena back in March, where folks were talking about how, to share limited GPU resources across large number of students in order to allow them access to learn the sort of techniques that they might use if they took a job at a place like G Research, or maybe the next startup that G Research is going to be the largest customer of. So I think it's interesting to see that innovation like kind of dominoes down to other parts of innovation, right? Like G Research has been a part of this wave of people who are using these GPUs to do new and exciting things. And then you look at the knock-on effect, and there's virtual GPU support in OpenStack, in the NVIDIA driver stack now. And you can sort of, it's almost like that situation where a butterfly is flapping its wings, and G Research is the butterfly sometimes. And I get to see the far side of those investments, some of them that G Research even made before I started here. I get to see the seeds start to blossom a little bit.
Yeah. There's a lot of technologies like that where when you're working on them, it feels like it's something that's very specific. But then when you actually apply it, you realize it's very general. And one of the great things about innovation, when you're working across, say, industry and academia, and you're not limiting yourself to trying to find a specific product to solve a specific problem, but you're looking for opportunities. And quite often you see things that are transferable. So I've had conversations with people doing PhDs in university where they're working using some GPUs, some resources where they've built some machine learning models, and actually they're applying it to some situation in biology, which is nothing to do with what we do. But the techniques that they're applying in their models are transferable. And once you have the conversation, say, that sort of thing could also apply in fintech. There's similar sorts of challenges, with, say, removing noise from data sets to find signal or things like this. And then the light kind of comes on, and they're perfectly happy and interested and keen to have conversations with people in adjacent domains where they can add some value, because at the end of the day, everybody's trying to add some value in some way, and it's seeing the connections often is the trick.
Yeah, that's so. Let's say, we kind of talked about, addressing the fact that there are maybe companies that don't want to participate in this open collaboration process and sort of give back their feedback to help open source projects innovate. Is there any specific advice you would give if there's someone who's listening who's an open source developer who is right now screaming at their computer screen or their radio to, please come talk to me, right? Like, I want that feedback. I know that's how I would feel if I was on the other side of this conversation, and I didn't work at G Research and get to experience that. So what would you say, to that open source developer who wants to solicit that kind of feedback from their users? What's the best case they can make to someone in your position at a different company?
I would say that if you think of like Venn diagrams, that it has to be some overlap. So I get a lot of cold calls. The title head of innovation means salespeople. They're hitting me up on LinkedIn. They're getting my phone number from goodness knows where, and there's a lot of them that are completely irrelevant. And this is wasting their time as well as my time. And this is a kind of a simple thing. If you can just see where there's an overlap and something in common, like even if someone's building some open source software that is not a good full fit, if there's something in it that is novel and is obviously relevant to a potential customer, and if they can be made aware of that, it might be just enough to stimulate them to give feedback about how to change the shape of the rest of it so that it would fit in with how they work, or that they could incorporate it in their tech stack.
So it's almost like you're saying to look for like a foothold in your use case, right? Like you're
Yeah.
not going to be able to approach someone who's not going to be able to use your software at all. But maybe if there's a nugget of your software that's useful to them, you can go show that to them and see if that company has any feedback. That maybe that boat could even go both directions, right? Like you could be in a situation where maybe you go and you say this little nugget seems like it fits you, and the company can go, oh well, not only that, but we also would use this too, which you would have no way of knowing,
Yeah.
or so that benefit can go both ways, and it's pretty exciting, and I am all about this idea because I've seen it happen in Ironic. We have some really cool features around trying to empower users to maintain their hardware better and more explicitly that have been added to Ironic that come directly from G-Research use cases. And what we find is we implement these and then go have conversations with people and they go, this is what I've always wanted. And it's like, well, why didn't you tell us that this is what you always wanted?
Yeah. I think there is a tendency with somehow people sometimes get to the point where they just assume that what they've got is what they've got, and they don't realize that actually it could change and evolve and grow. And the key thing for us and probably many others is whether they state it or not, is you want flexibility and fungibility. If you're investing a lot in a large estate of GPUs, you want to be able to make it flexible so that people can use it easily in a low friction way, and you get good utilization out of it. But they also quickly, pivot. If especially if it's like we're a research organization, that involves a lot of experimentation. That involves a lot of unpredictability and people wanting to change the way they're doing things. It's not all cookie cutter stuff. And so having tools that let you do that is really important.
One of the things that can be really difficult for an open source project to manage is that sort of multiplication of complexity that comes from that flexibility. And so getting some feedback from people about what actual knobs you need to put in for people to turn is really useful, because you can't always go the other direction where you've added so much flexibility that it's almost impossible to figure out how to use the software. And that gets kind of gross, which, like, that's the name of the podcast, right? We're the Gross Out Podcast.
Yes.
We always ask our guests a little bit about some sort of gross moment in their career in open source where there was some sort of headache or issue or speed bump that they had to overcome to get their work done, which is something that everyone encounters, young, old, new. It doesn't matter where you are in the lifecycle open source or technology in general, you're going to hit those. So do you maybe have a story or two about those speed bumps that you've experienced that might be helpful to the folks out there listening when they hit their own speed bumps?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple that I can think of that illustrate a bit of a trend. So in my early career, there was a system that had been written and then was due to be released to the customer. And this was a real-time platform, but they'd written it in COBOL, which was at the time was a common business language. And yes, it was a business application, but one of the challenges they found once they built the whole thing, and they tested it with a small number of devices connected to this. But once you got above a small number of devices, this system couldn't keep up with the data. It kept dropping data. It was meant to take information from various devices and then store them in a database and update some status and give a response. And there was no way that it could do it. And I looked at this and thought, okay, so there was no way there was enough time to rewrite the whole thing. So I rewrote a part of it in C and it got a bit faster. And then it still was not fast enough. I ended up building a device driver that just buffered all the I/O. Then the thing worked. But this is like a bit of assembly, a bit of C, and a massive COBOL thing. And it should never have been written really in COBOL in the first place. And this is like an example of being given a project. And I was, pulling my hair out from the beginning, thinking, how on earth am I going to make this thing meet the requirements? There's no way it could do it. And that was hard work to make that happen. And I felt like I was hacking it to make it work. And I had another one, which is possibly even more gross, which is a system that was one of the early object-oriented projects that I worked on. And everyone was pleased that, oh, great, we're going for the modern way of doing it. It's going to be object-oriented. And then they said, oh, yes, and of course, we have to conform to all the company's standards. So it's going to be, I think at the time it was Visual Basic for the GUI on the client and 2 mainframes running PL1 in the back end and C++ on the mainframe. And this was, I don't think anybody at that time had run. So that was the only way they could do object orientation all the way through. So they'd got these conflicting sets of requirements and said, yes, we need to do all of them. And it ended up being a bit of a Frankenstein, and the thing was a bit slow, and we ended up having to create object relational map layers that would be smart about which objects they would bring down, because they would know, a particular transaction, what objects were implicated in it. And there was a lot more work involved in making this thing hang together because of the complications of all the different technologies that didn't naturally work together. And all of these things to me are like examples of entrenchment in ideas, but people trying to do new things. And I think the lesson is that actually we need to step back. Everyone wants to do new things, but we can't just use the tools we've always had necessarily. The phrase, if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail, comes to mind. And I feel that there's something similar happening now. We're using so much generative AI, which is great and empowering. And people are generating code with it. And we started out with like LLMs were generating code where you can insert them as snippets. And now we're getting to the point that there are agentic systems where you can just say what you want and they'll go and check out the project, do some code, raise a PR for you. You can even chat with them over Slack, some of them. But still, people might fall into the trap of telling these AIs, I want you to write this thing in this way, using this language, which is just really their baggage. And there's this new, trend of what's called, I think, vibe programming, where if you get to the point where you've got AIs that are good enough, they can build the UI, the back end, everything, and test it, then maybe you can actually step back and just tell them what you want without trying to meddle with the details. And I wonder how much we should be experimenting more with this kind of thing and allow some freedom to not be restrained by, our own experiences.
That is super interesting, because you zigged when I expected a zag there a little bit, because I actually, with AI, I've always been concerned. I've been that guy who's like, write this in Python because I'm a Python developer.
Yeah.
But I've always gone and used these tools with sort of the mindset of, even if this is a way for me to get from point A to point B, I have to understand what comes out in order to really be able to use this. But it sounds almost like the tools are getting to the point where even for someone in your position, you're saying, yeah, it's fine that if you don't understand exactly what this code does, as long as you're able to validate the inputs and the outputs are what you want.
Exactly. I mean, and if you can do that reliably and repeatedly, and if the nature of these LLMs is you train them by pouring in the wisdom of the world, so and then you are giving them, if you like, what are our best examples of good practices and design patterns, and what kinds of programming languages are good for solving what kinds of problems. Why wouldn't you allow it to leverage that rather than adding additional constraints in that tie its arms and make it do it in a way that you would, would have done it.
That's interesting. But if I start getting COBOL back from ChatGPT, I'm going to have to be a little bit more directive in that case. But hey, thanks a lot for your time, Mark. This has been great. I especially enjoyed that last little bit of insight. That's one that I'm gonna be thinking about that for a while. But I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate G Research giving me time to do this podcast, and for you giving us your time, Mark. You're a very, very busy guy, and you're up late UK time for us. Really appreciate that. If you want to work with people like Mark or myself, you can go to gresearch.com/vacancies or click the link in the description of the podcast or the YouTube video and go ahead and see what we've got available on site in London, UK, and Dallas, Texas. It's a great, beautiful office there in Dallas, right across from where the Stars play. So for the Gross Out podcast, for Mark, for everyone here, I'd just like to thank you for your time. That was the Gross Out podcast, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jay. Great to have the conversation with you.